So this was an interesting project for me because I came into the first meeting as a total skeptic and borderline hater. I didn't want to use AI. I was sort of nervous about it sort of taking over.
Welcome to the Culture of Writing podcast, where writers, editors, and content strategists from Salesforce talk about how we work together to improve our craft and make content better.
I'm just going to be sharing some of my learnings and findings and how I've been researching AI functionality in CX. I know as an org, we've been trying to use Gen AI to be more efficient as a team and also improve our content quality and impact. So I remember they basically boiled it down to these 4 use case categories, which was content creation, content management, content publication and consumption, and content measurement. So kind of showing the vision of using AI in CX and how generative AI is such a powerful tool. And, we can really use it to, revolutionize our content, and it can also make us efficient by automating certain tasks and basically allowing writers to focus on more strategic work. So we do have some good guidelines kind of already set in place, but I also wanted to share some of my experiences and some tips that may be useful and some key takeaways that I've also learned as well. So I think the biggest takeaway I got was about your prompts. And this tip might sound repetitive, and you've probably heard it a lot because it really is all about your prompt. And I feel like your output will always be just as good as your input. So having clear prompts always yields better results. So the first one is to kind of set the stage and provide context. ChatGPT provides better content and ideas when it's given more clear instruction. So within your prompts, I think it'll give more nuanced answers if, it'll give the answers you want depending on your prompt. And then the second one is for starting with an action verb. I feel like for a lot of situations, it might be beneficial to start your prompt off with an action verb, such as summarize, edit, analyze. So AI has a clear goal of what it has to do. I've noticed that when I reflect on, what I want my end goal to be, and I do that, and then I think of the appropriate verb for it, and it tends to give the output that I intend more. The next one is to state your restrictions clearly. If you have a specific format or a specific word limit, I think including that in your prompt and being more specific is always better, and it yields the output that you want. And then the next one is to specify a tone and a target audience. I think if you define what tone you want the response to be formed in by writing, if the desired tone is casual or conversational or formal or informative, or even adding specifying your target audience, and if they're technical or non-technical, that can help you get a better output as well. And the last one is, if your prompt calls for it, maybe providing examples. I've noticed that when I provide examples with ChatGPT or SendGPT with reference material to give some context, it's always so helpful. So if you want a certain response, I think being specific with an example can guarantee that even more. And then my next more generic tip is kind of just learning to collaborate with AI and treating AI as a partner rather than a replacement. So using AI to assist in generating ideas or conducting research or suggesting improvements. I think by working alongside AI, you can enhance and produce higher quality content. For example, I was working on this legacy developer content, or we have a legacy developer content called Enhance Salesforce with Code. And this doc set was a starting place for new Salesforce developers, and it isn't owned by anyone. So right now it's kind of this jumble of information about pro code content, and some of our newest developer tools are missing from the doc set. And since it hasn't been owned, it hasn't been updated. So I was kind of working on figuring out a way to see if we can use AI to, one, summarize the information, which we know the tools are good at, but also with human help to kind of incorporate newer tools into the summaries. And I think, with AI, the strengths definitely lie in summarizing or rewording or editing text, but if you want to put in the extra effort, it can also be helpful with expanding text or brainstorming. So kind of, collaborating with AI, instead of writing a complete article by yourself, you can collaborate and give it context and points, and then ask AI to expand your text, carry out the legwork, and provide context and additional information. My next point is to be okay with experimenting. I think if AI gets it right the first time, or if it doesn't get it right the first time, you can always reframe and rephrase, dig deeper, because it is a conversation. So you don't have to accept the first output that you don't like. Instead, tell it that, what you like and what you don't, and offer suggestions for improvement. I know for ChatGPT, they have like a history, so you can always work off that. And then, yeah, my next one was kind of utilizing AI in different ways. I've touched upon how AI can help with writing, but it can be used in so many ways in CX, not just writing, like animations, diagrams, videos, scripts, research, translating code, or like translating like localization, API specs, sample data,
Great.
metrics, SEO, automation, internal stuff like onboarding. So there's so many ideas for you to use it. I work on a MuleSoft project called Composer, and we tend to be more involved in the UI text for it. So I recently got a request to create this tooltip text with some info the developer gave me, and I was having difficulty kind of wordsmithing it, but in a way that was, simple for our users. So I came up with a draft and I asked AI to help, and it was beneficial and it ended up helping out. So yeah, I think AI can really help in so many ways. It's not good at adding numbers though, actually. Recently I needed to total up a bunch of expenses for something. So I gave ChatGPT a bunch of transactions, like numbers to add, and it ended up giving like a completely wrong sum. I asked 3 more times and it gave the wrong answer every single time. So I ended up using Google Calculator and it worked. So don't use it for adding numbers. But yeah, it's definitely like such a process. I guess we're still learning like what works and what doesn't work with AI. So I'm excited to see what the new wave is. And I know we have this, maybe auto-generating release notes with AI, or like reference content for APIs, or generating first drafts of video scripts. So it's cool to see how the org is using AI so far. And yeah, it'll be great just learning from each other, sharing tips, see how we're all using it. So, we can all grow and use it more effectively going forward. But yeah, thank you.
That is awesome. Thank you so much.
I just was curious if you could say more about when you did the collaborate with UI, or
Yeah.
sorry, AI. What can you talk more about using it for research?
Yeah, I think if you have, I think the biggest thing is it can help brainstorm as well, like depending on your prompt. I think if you give the right context, it can help kind of with the starting point. Obviously, I think, like you said, for new content, you might need to like be there to collaborate and give it the information. But I think, it goes both ways. And if you want new content, and even like research, I think it's depending on the prompt. And I think if you give it the right things, it can help with that.
So like what kind of output would you expect to get from it for like a research task?
Yeah, I think, for example, like my example of, using the legacy content, I was trying to figure out, new ways of, we had like new methods for specific like code tools. And I think if you were to ask like, what are some tools that Salesforce might provide, and we can use that answers to like create more like doc sets as well.
It's helpful also to see your version already, because like I had never used AI before, and I actually came into this project really wanting to hate it. I was kind of scared about it, and I had a lot of concerns about, not necessarily replacing writers, but just sort of making you skip the part of our job that is about like ingesting information and understanding it, and then synthesizing it into something that is valuable for customers. And so it was tricky for me like coming into this, because I really I I didn't really know what to expect. Because I had been so nervous about it, I basically just like, scrolled past every article about AI because I was like, I don't need to know about it. I'm never going to use it. And so anyway, so it was interesting to actually try it. I was pleasantly surprised, and I would like to try to do different projects with it and see how it does. So that said, I kind of went off brief, and I instead of just using it to refactor legacy content, I tried a bunch of different things, and I now know that this is probably your basic AI information, but for me, I definitely learned that it was helpful to provide like existing content within the prompt itself, and whatever context and other like information you want it to work from, as opposed to just asking it something general and hope that it pulls the right information from the internet. So that was really effective. And then I also was impressed that it was able to process prompts that had a bunch of different rules in them. I think when I first tried it, I anticipated that I would have to say like, summarize this into 200 words, and then it would give me an output. And then I would put it back in and I would say, write this at an 8th grade reading level. And then I would take that output. And then I don't know why I thought that it wouldn't be able to process multiple things at once. But since I didn't expect it to do that, I was pleasantly surprised that it actually does quite well at that. So if you can identify what, your tone, your audience, your, specific words that you want it to use or not use, the length, maybe the format that it's going to go in, all of those kind of things. If you put that all, in just like one sentence, it did a really good job of parsing that and creating the output that I expected. So that was really nice. So as far as effective uses, it definitely was most effective at summarizing and rewriting existing text that I put directly into the prompt. I did initially say to rewrite to an 8th grade reading level, and it actually did a really good job, except for that it kept using the word stuff. And I was like, if you want to import your stuff, and then we'll save your stuff, and then you can do stuff with it. And so I had to tell it to not use stuff. I actually ended up, after I wrote these notes, I tried again with something else, and I actually had better luck in terms of like writing for like a Salesforce style. I felt like asking for a 10th grade reading level was actually like pretty on point as far as like the sort of level of like diction and stuff that we would expect. I was impressed also that I was able to take like an existing video script and then the task steps for 2 different topics. And I've just put that into the prompt and said, rework this into a 2-minute script for admins or something. I don't remember exactly the prompt, but it actually did a really good job of formatting it as like something spoken. And in one case, on one of them, the output, like it gave even like how long the duration might be. And then on this one, it actually suggested what should be showing on screen, which I thought was cool. But I don't know what, I'm not sure why it did it on that one and not the other, because I don't think that I had included, the only thing that I changed in the actual prompt, like outside of the content, was the duration. So for whatever reason on this one, it decided to give me the scene transitions, which I thought was interesting. So maybe that's something that you could request, like what should show on the screen, or what transitions should I use? So that was really cool to see. I did use it for 2 UI text requests. One was for an empty state and one was for prerequisites. And I thought that it actually did a pretty good job. It wasn't necessarily stuff that I would use directly. And that was where I realized that you have to be really specific about the format that you want with your prompt. It was giving me a bunch of longer descriptions until I asked it to limit to 10 words, and then it gave me more like what I was wanting. So again, just being really specific in that prompt was a critical piece of that. And then for ineffective uses, that was where I had this project where our UXer asked me to develop a framework that we could socialize for UX and CX around when to choose different status labels for different types of content and other kind of entities. And it was one of those things where I had a bunch of ideas rattling around in my brain, and I kind of knew what I needed to do, but I just couldn't really spit it out. Like I couldn't quite identify like what's the best grouping to use, or what's the difference between why I use this one and that one. Even though I know when to use one and not the other, I couldn't quite articulate it. And so the prompt that I gave it was basically like, actually I'll show it because I keep forgetting. So initially it was like, just create a framework of guidelines that help people understand when to use certain types of statuses based on whether the content is a message, a published piece of content, or an ongoing activity. And then I included all of the existing statuses. And what it ended up doing initially was kind of like defining the statuses for each thing, which wasn't what I wanted because I know what they are. I just, couldn't like wrap them in the right thing, I guess. And then so then I changed it a little bit and it continued to define them. And then I think by the end, I said specifically like, use phrasing such as, and do not define each status. Find connections among the available terms and group them. And so that was the most effective one. It still wasn't something that I could immediately give to my UXer, but the exercise of putting all this information in here kind of made me think more about what those categories are. And then I really didn't use almost any of what the output gave me from this, but like, again, just practicing teaching it what I wanted kind of helped me think about what I wanted. And then that gave me kind of the background that I needed to actually do the assignment. So yeah, not the best at like materializing information out of thin air or like extracting it from your brain when you haven't, given it to them. So, which is expected, but I was curious. It was definitely a time where I was like, I really don't even know where to start with this. So I'm just going to try it, see what happens. And so even though I didn't use it, use the output, it ended up being helpful. And then the best part of my update, which is to beware of the more recent versions. I did an experiment on writing UI text for a prerequisite. And initially it was like way too generic. It was just like, indicate the need to set up a prerequisite. And it was like, before you do this, set up user permissions. And that's like not even what I was talking about. So I got it down to like, I gave it a lot more tonal guidelines and gave it a word maximum and all that. And some of them were actually quite good. Unlock the full potential of Marketing Cloud by activating Data Cloud, ! So exciting. I still couldn't use that exactly, but it was functional, like it was getting to the point. So then later I wanted to test the different versions, and initially when I chose DaVinci, and it worked really well. I thought that the earlier ones, like 3.5, these ones are like pretty all right for our style and voice and tone. We can say hold on or oops sometimes. These worked pretty well. Data Cloud needs to be switched on first, or hold on, you need to turn on Data Cloud first. And then when I got into the later ones, it got kind of rude. And it started saying stuff like, power up the Data Cloud first, Captain. And I really can't believe that it said, hey, genius, switch on Data Cloud before proceeding. I mean, hey, genius, it just killed me. I don't know. I shared it with so many people because it was just next level. So anyway, then I had to tell it to not call the user names. So I said, be friendly and helpful and don't be condescending or call the reader names. And so that time, the 4.32 and 4 did okay. So like you missed this, or this is still pending or whatever. So that kind of reined it back in. But so if you want something like really, super conversational or, super lighthearted and it's not going into a Salesforce app, then maybe that's all right. But yeah, so it was really interesting having come into it, not expecting much or sort of being even a little afraid of it, and with like no really background on how to use it or what to expect. Ended up being a really fun exercise. I did try it for, the short desk rewrite, finding synonyms, which is actually kind of helpful too, because I have one of the old like Roger thesauruses where it's like not like dictionary style, right? It's not alphabetical, it's like grouped by a concept. And it's really helpful. Like I use online thesauruses now, but like but it's kind of nice to be able to type into a prompt something that just says like, what's another word for, like, give me 3 other words for this kind of thing, but with this context or with like this connotation, or like avoiding this type of word, or not too technical or whatever. And you can give it all these other kinds of like details around the kind of word that you want. And I was actually impressed by some of the outputs there where I was like, just couldn't put my finger on the word that I wanted. And it was like, oh, did you mean operations? And I'm like, that's the one. So yeah, it was cool to use it for different stuff. I would love to try it on some bigger refactor projects in condensing some of the content that we have and see how it does at that. So
You talked about refactoring idea. Can you just elaborate on that just a little bit?
yeah, so one of the things I need to do soon is refactor some large amounts of content for Marketing Cloud. And I'm curious if it would be able to, for example, if I took like 10 topics from the same doc set and say I had information from CSG or support about what are the things that customers most need to understand to succeed at this, what are the things that they have the most questions about, if I could feed all of that into a prompt properly and say something like, condense this into 1,200 words, grouped by whether it's a task or conceptual information or something like that, and figure out exactly how to write that prompt. Could you take 10 pages of content and condense it into 2 or 3 without having to do that all manually? And I think that part of having done a lot of manual refactoring, getting familiar with the content and identifying what can go and what needs to stay just takes a lot of time. And you second guess yourself a lot, and you do a ton of different drafts, and there's a ton of back and forth with SMEs. And if you could just cut out at least some of that, and then go to your subject matter folks and be like, is this safe? Then like I could just imagine that cutting so much down of the refactoring process. And then just any kind of uplift project where you have existing content and you maybe want to say like shift the tone a little bit, or you want to rewrite it but without mentioning some other product, or specifically write it towards a specific use case or something like that, then you could come out with just hopefully a workable first draft, and really cut out a lot of like, you've still done the important parts of like the content strategy and understanding what needs to be focused on, and that you need to reduce the amount of content and where it needs to live and stuff like that, because all that information has to be known so you can put it into your prompt. And then you're just streamlining the part between having it in here and getting it onto paper, and then being able to have something to work from. Because that first moment when you're like, I have all this content and I just want it to be one topic instead of 10. And then you just stare at your screen, like that whole process of like getting started, I think could really be improved. So I would love to test that.
And you made a really interesting point earlier, which I thought was fascinating, which I realize you haven't tested it yet, but you said part of the prompt could be, if you're doing this refactoring, let's say we have 10 big topics and we want to condense it, as you say, that part of the prompt could be, and customer service says these are the important, these are what the customers are asking for.
Yeah. So I think like, as long as you get input, like, so when you're doing the content strategy piece of identifying what needs to go into the prompt itself, talk to CSG, talk to support, figure out like, so CSG success guides are really great about knowing what are the primary things people need to know to be able to be successful. And then customer support is really helpful for saying, these are the places where people have problems. These are the places where these are really big pain points, and maybe that's stuff that we need to include, or maybe it's stuff we need to say more about, or maybe it's stuff that we need to say more about more simply, or something like that. And so I think getting those inputs from customer facing, folks can be really helpful in getting that into the prompt so that you know exactly what you're asking for.
Well, what's interesting from both of you is we already have themes. You've already both uncovered themes that are together. So I can't thank you enough for your time, because I know we went over. So much appreciated. I think it's going to be so helpful to a lot of writers and editors are in the same boat, right? Everybody's a little nervous, a little scared about it. So this is really great.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend.
You too.
Setting this up.
Take care.
You too.
I feel better. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.